While Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, the man the Mexican government knew as Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, the man the cartel world knew as El Mencho, was being treated for a series of severe kidney complications at an undisclosed location somewhere in the mountains of Jalisco in the spring of 2023, 300 miles away. In the grimy sprawl of the Tierra Caliente borderlands, a man in his early 40s was already making decisions that no subordinate should have been making. He was approving shipments. He was signing off on territorial disputes. He was sitting at the head of a table where, 6 months earlier, his presence would have required permission. His nickname, absurd, almost comedic by the standards of a world that produced monikers like El Diablo, El Verdugo, El Sangre, was El Yogurt. And in the narco corridors of Western Mexico, nobody was laughing. Who is the man behind that name? How does someone with no founding mythology, no bloodline claim to the CJNG throne, no celebrated origin story, come to stand at the edge of the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the Western Hemisphere? If El Mencho truly is gone, dead, incapacitated, or simply vanished into the machinery of his own paranoia, what happens to an empire built entirely around one man's fear and one man's violence? And what does it tell us about organized crime in the 21st century that the man who may inherit it all goes by a name you'd see on a grocery store shelf? What you are about to discover over the next several minutes will fundamentally alter how you understand succession in criminal organizations. This is the story of the man who may already control Mexico's most dangerous cartel, and who still almost nobody in the world can identify by face. There is a particular irony embedded in the structure of the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, an irony that becomes visible only when you look at the organization not as a criminal enterprise but as a political one. The CJNG was built, from its very foundations in the late 2000s, on a principle of absolute centralization. Unlike the Sinaloa cartel, which operated through a loose federation of semi-autonomous plaza bosses, unlike the Gulf cartel, which maintained power through an elaborate system of internal alliances, the CJNG was a vertical structure, a pyramid with one apex. Everything flowed upward. Nothing flowed sideways. The man at the top did not share power. He did not have partners. He had subordinates, and he had enemies. And the line between those two categories was, according to the testimony of multiple cooperating witnesses in United States federal proceedings, often indistinguishable. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes built that structure deliberately. Investigators with the Drug Enforcement Administration, who have tracked the CJNG's evolution since approximately 2011, describe in court filings an organization whose command hierarchy was modeled less on traditional cartel structures and more on the logic of a military unit, compartmentalized, disciplined, with information flowing strictly on a need-to-know basis. According to documents entered into evidence in the Southern District of New York, El Mencho maintained direct control over no fewer than 47 separate operational cells across 12 Mexican states. Each cell leader knew the name of exactly one person above them. Nobody below El Mencho himself held a complete picture of the organization's geography. This structure created extraordinary operational security. It also created an extraordinary vulnerability, because an organization with one apex is not a network, it is a wheel. And when the hub fails, the entire wheel stops. The question that investigators, rival cartels, and the CJNG's own internal power structure have been grappling with since at least 2022 is precisely this. What happens to a wheel when the hub disappears? The answer, emerging slowly from intelligence reports, court filings, and the testimony of cooperating witnesses, centers on a figure whose operational biography remains deeply incomplete. A man known in the cartel's communications intercepts by a rotating series of aliases, and to those who deal with him directly by a single, bewildering name, El Yogurt. His real name, according to documents filed by the United States Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control in February of 2024, is Eric Valencia Salazar. He is not young, born in the early 1980s in Jalisco State, making him somewhere in his early 40s. He is not a founding member of the CJNG. He is not a legend of the drug trade. He does not have a corrido written about him. Not a famous one, anyway. What he has, according to American and Mexican intelligence assessments reviewed by investigative journalists covering the cartel beat, is something rarer and more dangerous. Competence, patience, and an 18-year operational record inside the organization that has taught him exactly where every body is buried. The question nobody has been able to answer with certainty is how someone with that profile, methodical, lateral, never the headline, comes to stand at the edge of the throne. But to understand that, you have to understand where the CJNG came from. And that story begins not with El Mencho, but with the organization that the CJNG destroyed in order to be born. The Millennium Cartel, Los Milenio, once controlled Jalisco State with the same quiet, bureaucratic efficiency that makes long-running criminal organizations survivable. By the late 1990s, the Milenio Cartel had established a working relationship with the Sinaloa Federation that kept Jalisco relatively stable, a defined corridor for cocaine moving north from Colombia through the Pacific coast, a predictable system of plaza fees, and the kind of institutionalized corruption that Mexican federal investigators would later describe in court documents as a parallel government operating alongside the legitimate one. The Milenio leadership, the Valencia family, the Amezcua Contreras brothers, were businessmen first. Violence was a tool of last resort. Discretion was the operating principle. That world ended with extraordinary speed between 2009 and 2011, when the organization that would become the CJNG emerged from the ruins of a Milenio cartel already fractured by arrests, internal betrayals, and the predatory attention of the Sinaloa Federation. The men who would build the CJNG took with them not just the Milenio's territory, but its institutional memory, its contacts, its roots, its corrupted officials. And they replaced the Milenio's culture of discretion with something the Mexican drug trade had not seen at that scale in years. Deliberate, maximalist, almost theatrical violence deployed as a branding strategy. According to the indictment unsealed against Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia in 2017, the CJNG's early expansion was characterized by a specific tactical innovation: the public display of force as a deterrent mechanism. Where the Milenio had ruled quietly, the CJNG ruled loudly. Banners hung from highway overpasses identifying the cartel and warning rivals. Narco messages left at crime scenes were typed on CJNG letterhead, such as it was. The organization wanted to be known, feared, and legible to everyone: law enforcement, rivals, and the population, simultaneously. It was a gamble. It worked. What almost nobody remembers about this period, and this is the detail that most people who study the CJNG tend to overlook, is that the organizational infrastructure that made the CJNG's early expansion possible was not built by El Mencho alone. It was built by a second tier of operators who handled the operational mechanics while El Mencho handled the political and military direction. The people who managed the logistics chains, the people who handled the money, the people who vetted the plaza bosses. These were not the faces on the wanted posters. They were never meant to be. But without them, there was no CJNG. not in the form that exists today. Eric Valencia Salazar, El Yogurt, was, according to multiple independent assessments by American and Mexican law enforcement, reviewed by investigative journalists, one of those operators. Not a founding member in the mythologized sense, not a commander who led the battles of the early expansion, but someone who was present, functional, and indispensable in ways that only became visible years later, when the people above him began to disappear. The question that this story is actually asking, the one underneath the surface question about succession, is this: does a criminal organization outlive the myth that built it? Does the CJNG survive El Mencho? Keep that question in mind, because the answer is going to force a reckoning with everything we think we know about how power works in the 21st century drug trade. But before we go further, you need to know something that changes how you've been reading this story. El Yogurt's emergence as a potential successor to El Mencho is not primarily a story about ambition. It is a story about elimination, because between 2018 and 2023, the CJNG's internal leadership landscape did not gradually shift in his direction. It was carved in his direction, one arrest and one disappearance at a time, until the field narrowed to a point where his elevation became almost structural, almost inevitable. Consider the sequence. In 2018, El Mencho's brother Antonio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Quini, was arrested by Mexican federal forces and subsequently extradited to the United States, where he awaits trial on charges that include drug trafficking and money laundering across multiple decades of operations. In 2019, El Mencho's son, Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, El Menchito, was also extradited north, surrendered to American authorities who had been seeking him since his first indictment in 2017. The CJNG's internal finance structures, which El Quini had managed for years across a network of real estate holdings, shell companies, and legitimate businesses spanning at least 8 countries, were abruptly leaderless. In 2020, Mexican security forces killed El Mencho's son-in-law, Rodrigo Sanchez Duarte, El Richie, in a confrontation in Jalisco State. In 2021, the cartel's primary liaison to Guatemala's drug trafficking infrastructure, whose identity Mexican authorities have not publicly confirmed, was reportedly eliminated in an operation whose details remain classified. By the end of 2022, the cohort of CJNG leaders who had been in place since the cartel's founding era had been reduced, through arrest, extradition, and death, to a fraction of its original size. El Yogurt did not rise through these circumstances. He survived them. That distinction matters more than it might appear. Survival inside a criminal organization under sustained law enforcement pressure is not passive. It requires operational adaptability, the ability to function under conditions of extreme surveillance pressure while continuously reorganizing the structures around you. It requires political intelligence, the ability to maintain alliances when the organization you belong to is simultaneously destroying its enemies and consuming its own. And it requires, above all, the willingness to absorb responsibilities that are not technically yours, that come with no formal promotion and no public recognition, simply because you are the person still standing when the responsibilities need to go somewhere. According to documents filed by the United States Treasury Department in the designation notice for Eric Valencia Salazar published in February of 2024, El Yogurt had, by that point, assumed direct operational control over CJNG activities in at least 3 Mexican states. A geographic footprint that, while smaller than El Mencho's total domain, represented a significant consolidation for a single, non-founding operator. The designation identified him as a key leader within the organization, It was the United States government's formal acknowledgement of what had been whispered in intelligence circles for at least 2 years. That El Yogurt was no longer a middle-tier figure. He had become something else entirely. The secondary loop that this designation opens, and which we will return to, is what it reveals about the structure of the CJNG itself. Because an organization that can be inherited, functionally, if not formally, by someone the outside world barely knew existed, may be more durable than one dependent on a single mythological figure, or it may simply be demonstrating in real time that the myth was the only thing holding it together. Up to this point, we have been watching a process of elimination, a field of potential successors narrowed by arrests, extraditions, and violence, until one man emerges with his hands on more levers than anyone else. But what we haven't examined yet is the man himself, the operational biography, the specific shape of what El Yogurt actually built, and how he built it in the years before anyone outside of DEA intelligence reports had heard his name. The picture that emerges from court documents, Treasury Department designations, and investigative journalism is not what you would expect from a potential cartel kingpin. El Yogurt does not fit the archetype. The archetype, El Mencho, El Chapo, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, is characterized by a particular combination: extreme personal charisma, theatrical violence deployed at the right moments for maximum psychological effect, a mythology that precedes and outlasts the physical person. These are men who understood that running a cartel is partly a performance, a projection of invincibility that keeps hundreds of subordinates loyal and thousands of potential rivals deterred. The myth does as much work as the violence, sometimes more. El Yogurt, by every available account, is not that. Those familiar with his operational methods, speaking to journalists under conditions of anonymity given the obvious safety implications, describe a figure who is deliberately unmythological, who does not project, who manages rather than commands, who built his position inside the CJNG, not through spectacular acts that entered the organization's collective memory, but through the relentless, unglamorous accumulation of operational indispensability. He controlled logistics. He managed the financial instruments. He handled the relationships with the plaza bosses in ways that were invisible from the outside precisely because they functioned smoothly. This is the character revelation that changes the shape of the story. El Yogurt's contradiction is not the contradiction of the brutal man who loved his children, or the intelligent man who made a catastrophic miscalculation. His contradiction is structural. He is a man suited by temperament and method to run an organization, and possibly unsuited by those same qualities to seize one. Because in the transition moment, in the vacuum created by El Mencho's incapacitation or death, what the CJNG needs is not just an administrator. It needs a symbol, and symbols in the cartel world are not appointed. They are either born or they are made, usually at significant cost, usually in blood. This is the open question at the center of El Yogurt's story. Can competence substitute for mythology? Can an organization that was built on a culture of terrifying, concentrated personal authority survive a transition to a manager? The answer, beginning to emerge from the early reporting on internal CJNG dynamics in the period since El Mencho's reported deterioration, is not reassuring for anyone involved on any side of this story. There is a part of this story that the major outlets covering Mexican organized crime have touched on carefully, too carefully, perhaps, because its implications are destabilizing in multiple directions simultaneously. It is this: the uncertainty about El Mencho's status is not accidental, it is manufactured. The CJNG, under El Mencho's direction, and now apparently under the operational leadership of figures including El Yogurt, has maintained deliberate ambiguity about its leader's condition since at least 2022. Mexican government officials have, in their public communications, oscillated between suggesting that El Mencho is incapacitated and suggesting that he remains in operational command. The DEA's public posture, as of the most recent available reporting, is similarly cautious, acknowledging deteriorating health reports while declining to confirm his death or permanent removal from command. American intelligence agencies, multiple news organizations have reported, are themselves uncertain. This ambiguity is not the result of intelligence failure. It is, in the assessment of multiple cartel analysts cited in investigative reporting by Insight Crime and other specialized outlets, a tactical decision. A dead or incapacitated El Mencho is a destabilizing force for rivals who might test the organization's resolve, for subordinates whose loyalty may have been personal rather than institutional, for government officials whose corrupt arrangements may need to be renegotiated with new counterparties. An El Mencho whose status is uncertain is, paradoxically, more stabilizing. The myth endures longer than the man. But here's the part nobody has fully reported. If El Yogurt is managing the operational infrastructure of the CJNG, while El Mencho's mythological status is being artificially maintained, if he is, functionally, running the organization while the organization officially reports to a ghost, then El Yogurt is not a successor. He is a regent. And the historical record of regents in criminal organizations, as in kingdoms, is not encouraging. Regents accumulate power in the absence of authority. But when authority reasserts itself, or when the fiction of its reassertion collapses, regents are the first to pay. The transition from regent to ruler requires a moment of open declaration. It requires, in the vocabulary of the cartel world, a demonstration. And the demonstrations available to someone in El Yogurt's position are the exact kinds of demonstrations that attract the attention of the DEA, the Mexican Secretaría de Seguridad, and every rival organization waiting to test the CJNG's post-Mencho coherence. Consider what he is facing simultaneously. To the northwest, the Sinaloa cartel, itself fracturing along the fault lines created by Joaquin Guzman Lopez's betrayal of El Mayo Zambada, is nonetheless watching for territorial openings in Nayarit and Sinaloa State, regions where the CJNG has historically operated with impunity. To the east, the Cartel de los Zetas Nuevo, reconstituted under various regional names, has been testing CJNG perimeter positions in Guanajuato and Michoacán, states where the organization has maintained a costly and contested presence since approximately 2013. And internally, the CJNG's own plaza bosses, the regional commanders who managed territory under El Mencho's absolute authority, are now operating in a command environment where the absolute authority is, at minimum, diminished. What comes next in this story is the part that no analyst has been able to fully predict, but the structural logic of the situation points in a direction that is worth stating clearly. What do you do with an empire your predecessor built around himself? Can you hold it? Can you reshape it? The question that still divides every serious observer of this situation is this: is El Yogurt managing a transition or presiding over a fracture? There may not be a clean answer, but by the end of this story, you'll have enough to make your own judgment. The turning point in El Yogurt's operational trajectory, the moment where the story pivots from accumulation to declaration, came not through a single dramatic act, but through a series of territorial consolidations in the first half of 2023 that, taken individually, looked like ordinary cartel maintenance operations. Taken together, they looked like something else entirely. In Jalisco State, the CJNG's home territory, the origin of its name, the locus of El Mencho's mythological geography, reports began emerging in early 2023 of a reorganization of local command structures. Plaza bosses who had been in place for years were replaced. Tribute collection routes were adjusted. The specific financial instruments used to move cartel revenue through legitimate business fronts in Guadalajara's commercial sector were restructured, according to reporting by the investigative outlet Animal Politico, in ways consistent with a change in financial management at the organizational apex. These are not the moves of a regent maintaining a placeholder position. These are the moves of someone assuming ownership. And then there is the violence. The CJNG under El Mencho was characterized by a specific kind of violence, spectacular, symbolic, designed for maximum psychological effect. The mass murders staged in places designed for discovery. The videos, the banners, the performance of absolute power as a deterrent mechanism. This violence was terrifying, but it was also, in its own terrible logic, disciplined. It was violence with a message. The violence associated with the internal CJNG restructuring of 2023 was different in character. According to reporting by Reforma and corroborating sources in the specialized security press, a series of killings inside the organization targeted figures whose loyalty to the old command structure was considered uncertain. Not rivals, not enemies, but internal figures whose primary relationship had been with the previous configuration of leadership. In the cartel analyst community, this pattern has a specific name: organizational hygiene. It is what happens when a new power consolidates itself not against external threats, but against internal ones. 11 individuals associated with CJNG operations in Jalisco and Michoacán were killed in a period of approximately 90 days in the first half of 2023. Their deaths were not attributed publicly to any specific internal conflict. They did not generate the kind of media coverage that accompanies cartel battles between organizations. They were, for the most part, noted briefly in local crime reports and then filed away. That quietness, that administrative quality to the killing, that is the fingerprint. Now comes the moment this story has been building toward. In October of 2023, according to a reconstruction published by the investigative journalism organization Insight Crime and corroborated by reporting in the Mexican security press, a meeting took place somewhere in Jalisco State that brought together the CJNG's regional commanders for what multiple sources described as a restructuring summit. These events, internal cartel leadership gatherings, are extraordinarily rare in organizations with significant law enforcement exposure. The risk of a single surveillance operation neutralizing multiple senior leaders simultaneously makes them, as a general operational principle, suicidal. The fact that this meeting happened at all is the data point. Whoever called that meeting was willing to accept that risk. Whoever called that meeting was confident enough in their operational security and in their authority to gather the organization's senior tier in a single location and deliver in person whatever communication required delivery in person. The myth collapse, the moment when the legend of El Mencho as the untouchable, omnipresent authority of the CJNG gives way to the operational reality of an organization transitioning to new management, is not a single dramatic scene. It is this quiet meeting in Jalisco with regional commanders who once reported to an almost supernatural figure of fear and dominion, now sitting across a table from a man named after a dairy product, listening to him explain the new arrangements. That is not a cinematic moment, but it may be the most important moment in the CJNG's history since El Mencho founded it, because it means the organization has survived the first test. Not the external test of rivals or law enforcement, but the internal test of whether it can exist without its myth. Let's locate exactly where we are in this story. the CJNG has survived El Mencho's reported incapacitation in functional terms. Operations continue, territory is largely held. Revenue flows persist. And at the operational center of that survival is a figure whose public profile remains, deliberately, almost invisible. The question this story has been building toward is whether invisibility is an asset or a liability in the moment of succession. What the intelligence record now reveals is that it is, simultaneously, both. The United States Treasury Department's designation of Eric Valencia Salazar in February of 2024 was, in the careful language of sanctions notices, a formal acknowledgement that he had become a priority target. The designation froze any assets he held in United States jurisdiction, prohibited American individuals and entities from conducting business with him, and, critically, placed his name and photograph in the formal record of individuals subject to the Kingpin Act. This was the American government's public statement of what its intelligence community had concluded privately. El Yogurt was no longer a supporting figure. He was, in their assessment, a principal. The designation was also, in the perverse logic of cartel signaling, a kind of credential. Inside an organization where American law enforcement attention functions as a measure of operational significance, being designated under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act communicates something to subordinates that no internal announcement can replicate. It communicates, this person matters enough to be the enemy of the most powerful law enforcement apparatus in the world. The specific charges embedded in the designation are instructive about the scope of El Yogurt's operations. The Treasury Department's notice described his role as involving direction of CJNG drug trafficking operations. Not just logistics support, not just financial management, but direction. It identified him as responsible for coordinating the shipment of methamphetamine and fentanyl, the two commodities that have, since approximately 2018, become the CJNG's primary revenue sources, displacing cocaine in terms of margin and volume. American law enforcement documents reviewed by investigative journalists estimate the CJNG's annual fentanyl trafficking revenue at figures exceeding $2 billion at street value, a figure that would rank the organization among the largest pharmaceutical distributors in North America, if its product were legal. El Yogurt controls, according to American intelligence assessments, a meaningful portion of that infrastructure. Not all of it. The CJNG is too large and too geographically dispersed for any single operator to control all of it. But a meaningful, documented portion in states that include Jalisco, Colima, and parts of Michoacán. That is the major revelation. This is not a rumored succession story. It is, in the formal legal and intelligence record of the United States government, an already documented transfer of operational authority. The question of whether El Yogurt will be the next CJNG Kingpin partially misframes the situation. In operational terms, in significant parts of the organization's infrastructure, he already is. The final revelation in this story is not about El Yogurt specifically. It is about what his emergence reveals about the CJNG as an institution, and what that reveals about the failure of every strategic assumption that has governed American and Mexican counter-narcotics policy for the past 2 decades. The logic of Kingpin strategy, the formal doctrine that guides DEA and Mexican law enforcement prioritization of cartel leadership targets, rests on a specific model of how criminal organizations function. The model holds that organizations built around dominant individuals are vulnerable at the apex. Remove the leader, and the organization fractures. The evidence base for this model is real. The Guadalajara cartel collapsed after the arrest of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo in 1989. The Juarez cartel declined significantly after the death of Amado Carrillo Fuentes in 1997. The Arellano Felix organization in Tijuana atrophied as its founding brothers were killed or captured through the 2000s. El Mencho appears to have studied this history. What the CJNG's organizational architecture and El Yogurt's emergence within it suggests is that El Mencho, whatever his other qualities, understood the strategic vulnerability of the dominant individual model and built, over the last several years of his operational period, a second tier of the organization that could function without him. Not a formal succession plan. These are not institutions with corporate governance documents, but a structural redundancy, a set of operational relationships, financial instruments, and territorial arrangements that could persist under different management. El Yogurt is the beneficiary of that architecture. He did not build it. He inherited it. And the question of whether he can maintain it, whether the CJNG's second-tier competence can replace its first-tier mythology, is the question that will determine whether the organization remains a single entity or becomes, over the next several years, a confederation of regional actors using the CJNG brand the way franchisees use a company name, for the recognition it confers without the central authority it once implied. The families of the more than 200,000 people killed in Mexico's drug war since 2006 do not have the luxury of treating this as an organizational management question. For them, the transition from El Mencho to El Yogurt, from theatrical maximalist violence to quieter administrative consolidation, is not a subject of analytical interest. It is a lived reality in Jalisco State, in Michoacán, in Colima, in the border communities where fentanyl moves north and money moves south, and the individuals caught in the middle have no legal recourse and no protection. The American overdose crisis, which claimed more than 100,000 lives in 2022 alone, a significant portion of those deaths attributable to fentanyl produced in CJNG-affiliated laboratories, is not an abstraction. It is the real cost of this transition, not paid by El Yogurt, not paid by the cartel's leadership, paid by the people at the end of the supply chain on both sides of the border. The engagement question at this moment, the one worth sitting with, is this: does it matter in any practical sense for the people paying that cost who is at the top of the CJNG? Is El Yogurt a different threat than El Mencho? Or is the organization so institutionalized at this point that the person at the apex is, to some extent, interchangeable? Both interpretations are defensible. The evidence supports both. Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is the kind of question where the answer you arrive at says something about how you understand power, institutions, and whether individuals actually drive history or simply inhabit structures that would have produced the same outcomes regardless. Here is the final irony at the center of this story, and it is the kind of irony that does not require commentary. El Mencho built the CJNG around the principle that one man's absolute authority was the organization's greatest strength, that the concentration of power in a single, feared, mythologized figure was not a vulnerability, but a feature. He enforced that principle through 2 decades of operational control. He eliminated people who threatened it. He structured every layer of the organization to reflect it. And what that architecture produced, in the end, was its own negation, an organization capable of surviving without him, and a successor defined precisely by his lack of the qualities that El Mencho valued most. The man who may inherit the CJNG is not feared the way El Mencho was feared. He is not mythologized. He does not perform. He manages. The empire built on the principle of irreplaceable individual authority has produced, as its next chapter, a figure who suggests that no one is irreplaceable. That is not a lesson El Mencho intended to teach. It is the lesson his organization is now demonstrating without him. The real cost of this story, the fentanyl deaths, the displaced communities, the corrupted institutions, the families on both sides of the border who will never be made whole, was not paid by the people who made the decisions. It was paid, as it always is, by the people who had no say in those decisions at all. The question that remains, with no clean answer, is the one at the core of every succession story in organized crime. When the myth ends and the manager begins, does the violence change? Or does it simply find a different signature? After everything you just learned, does El Yogurt's profile make the CJNG more dangerous or less dangerous than it was under El Mencho? A manager with a functional infrastructure or a symbol with an army? Which one do you actually fear more? Let us know in the comments. There's no consensus on this, and we want to know where you come down. If this story mattered to you, if this is the kind of investigative depth you want more of, subscribe so you're here when the next chapter of this story breaks. No speculation, no padding, just the documented facts behind the organizations shaping our world. This is where the real stories live, the ones behind the headlines. The myth of El Mencho may be over. The story of what he built, and who is now running it, is only beginning.